Hi there, and welcome to Graeme Codrington's Future of Work podcast, where we provide insights into how the world is going to change and practical resources to help you make it a reality today. This is episode 3 of the Future of Work podcast, and in this episode we're going to be looking at the issue of adaptive leadership. What I'm going to be doing during the course of this podcast is pulling in some audio streams from some of the sessions that our team at Tomorrow Today Global has done. As it happens, during the chaos of 2020, we actually put together a series of webinars. I interviewed a number of my colleagues. I interviewed some experts that I really felt had valuable insights. And I am going to be extracting some of the audio from those webinars every now and again as a podcast episode. And so I thought as we get this podcast underway, it's just episode 3, I'd give you a sense of what that feels like in case you're still deciding whether you want to subscribe to this podcast or not. So in this episode, we go all the way back to the beginning of lockdown in 2020, when Keith Coates, a co-founder of Tomorrow Today Global and our leadership expert, he has a particular focus on adaptive leadership, and Keith works with business schools all over the world. He's on contract, on faculty at London Business School and Cornell and Henley and Gibbs in South Africa and a number of other business schools around the world. And he does work on the issue of the way in which leadership frameworks are changing. And you'll hear that through the conversation. This was recorded for a live webinar, so apologies for the quality of the sound. It was recorded off of the live stream, which was a little bit glitchy in parts. And it was also recorded before Keith and I upgraded our studios, which we did in the middle of 2020 in response to some of the disruption that we were experiencing. So sit back, enjoy this conversation between myself and Keith, and we are referring to people who were listening in and sending in their live questions. So if you hear other names thrown into the mix, those were just people who were on the webinar and were throwing their questions at us and we were responding. I hope you enjoy this episode as we dive into adaptive leadership. Keith and I wanted to chat once more about something we are passionate about. We are working with lots of clients at the moment during lockdown, helping them think through their strategies, think through how they should respond to crisis and disruption. That's what we normally do. But a lot of leaders are struggling at the moment and are struggling with, and I think we've identified something that will be useful because they are struggling. They're struggling to deal with their team that are working from home. They're struggling to deal with their plans for the year that are now completely just torn up and thrown out. And the CFO still wants to see a budget somewhere and everybody's looking at him like, how? How is it even possible that we can put a budget together for you? The auditors are going to be coming in soon and asking questions about structure and strategy and systems and processes. And we're in the midst of chaos. We're in the midst of not knowing where we are, not knowing what to do. And I think that companies and their leaders are being found out. Keith, I mean, you're having similar experiences, right? As you're kind of chatting to people who needing help, but not necessarily giving the help that is needed or giving the space that is needed for the help they're asking. I mean, what are some of the experiences you're finding as companies are struggling to deal with the unknown?
Graeme, let me sort of tilt the discussion slightly, and you've summarized very well what companies and CEOs are experiencing. But I think one of the, and I say it so cautiously, one of the blessings of what we have gone through, if you can put it that way, when it comes to understanding organizations and how work gets done and how leadership gets practiced, is I think that this is going to be a significant shift in all of those areas. I think we'll look back on this much like when you're teaching on leadership and you look back at where management emerged from and the impact of the Industrial Revolution and urbanization on organizations and organizational practice, I think that this will be as, if not more significant in the life of work and the understanding of leadership as any of those huge events, digitization or the Industrial Revolution, etc.
Keith, I agree completely on that. And what I'm seeing is, and I do think you and I were chatting earlier in the week, and this is what got me to schedule this conversation in this webinar format. I think the big issue here is that control is now being shown up. That most managers would swear blind. They're not micromanagers. They delegate. They give their team authority and responsibility. But I mean, you and I have been working with companies for 2 decades where we've seen that they haven't. I mean, everything from, you tell a joke in the boardroom and everybody looks at the CEO to wait to see if he laughs or not. And then they all laugh. Well, I mean, we've seen this. We're not making this stuff up. It actually happens. And now, I mean, we've been working with a few clients over the last few days who are wanting us to help them to talk about leadership and management of virtual teams and remote teams. And these managers are being so controlling in the way they even want us to run the workshops on virtual teams. It's actually ridiculous. And you almost think you want to say to the client, this isn't going to work, right? This workshop is not going to work because there's an underlying problem, and that is your need for control. And I think this COVID crisis is going to expose that need for control, and only the companies that are able to shift away from the command and control approach to leadership are actually going to survive and survive the rest of the 2020s as well.
Graeme, all the management tools we've got are designed to control. If you go to the world of theatre and you look at how the theatre uses terminology, they never refer to people and management. In the theatre world, managers are people who manage things. They manage the lighting, the production, the sound, etc. When it comes to the people aspect of theatre, you have directors. And I think that, there's been this old argument of what is the difference between management and leadership? And it's a bit of a red herring. I think one of the casualties of COVID-19 is going to be we'll finally get rid of that toolbox that we call management. The understanding that you can manage people, because it's just so frustrating trying to talk about how to modernize management techniques in a world where you're dealing with digitization, with freedom of choice, with flexibility, with generational mind shifts that don't want to be managed. And this might be the thing that finally means we can dump this term management, get rid of some of those archaic tools that simply don't work, and understand that there's a better and different way to get business efficiency happening. Now, this sounds maybe very theoretical, and at one level it is, because you've got to think before you can practice. One of the things I love about adaptive leadership is that it understands leadership as not a job. Leadership is not a job. Leadership is a practice. Leadership is used as a verb. And in essence, what that means is anybody can lead when you understand leadership as a practice. And I think that for those companies, and especially those executives who are really willing to think about how do we organize work, how do we build an adaptive culture, there's a whole new conversation to be had and a whole bunch of new tools that can be learned. And they work. This isn't just theory, they work.
Yeah. And I think a lot of leaders might say, well, if we've got to push down authority in the organization. So let's give a practical example, right? A lot of companies are scrambling at the moment, and their salespeople and their client relationship managers are out there speaking to clients. And the rule book's thrown out the window now, and you've got to get your sales team engaging with the clients to say, what do you really need? What do you really want? What is your budget? And to have this conversation. So many organizations now The salesperson or the client relationship manager goes out and has the conversation, and then there's an entire chain of command they've got to go back through in order to say, can I give this client a discount? Can I offer them a slightly different package from what they've had before, to either sweeten the deal or to solve a real problem that I see in the client? But they've then got to go back through their sales supervisor, the client relationship manager. They've got to get buy-in from this department and that department. And it can take days and be frustrating. Whereas what you need to be saying, right, is surely the salesperson or the client relationship manager has everything that they need. They understand where we are. They understand the context. They know the parameters of what it is they're selling. Surely you should just give them the authority. You've given them the responsibility to speak to the clients, come up with a plan. Why don't you just give them the authority and let them make an offer to the client with no, they don't have to go back through that management control system again. But of course, the bosses that we speak to then come back and say, well, I can't trust my sales team to do that. They will make a mistake if they do that. And maybe they're right. So maybe there's a whole lot of training and things that has to be put in place so that their sales team can do it in the future. But this is part of the problem, Keith, isn't it? That we have got organizations where the responsibility that people have in the organization and the authority that they have is mismatched completely. They've been given responsibility, but actually no authority because the control is still held by the bosses. I think companies are going to be found out when they do that. And I think, as you say, COVID will be a blessing if you realize that this is a problem and you actually begin to make the changes that will move you in a new direction.
You see, I think, Graeme, when you understand what it will take to be a truly adaptive organization, you've got to go back to the very foundations. And the way we've traditionally built companies with silos and with a lot of firewalls between departments is not conducive to being able to short circuit that authority, that decision-making process. So in the average company, what happens with information flows to authority. So at the executive level, they get all these information pipelines feeding them, sales, HR, etc. Information in the organization is designed to flow to authority. In an adaptive organization, exactly the opposite happens. Authority is made to flow to where the information sits. So if that salesperson that you talked about understands clearly the company's purpose and what the end game is and what the objective is, and has enough other pieces of the puzzle, why wouldn't you give him or her the right authority to make a decision there and then? So it's a situation of a company wanting to be adaptive says, how do we make sure that authority flows to where the right information sits? And surely that salesperson, using this example, is the best equipped to make the call. They are the frontline person dealing with the client. And if they are responsible and understand the organization's purpose, why would you not want to give them authority?
Yeah.
And why I know this works is that McChrystal in his wonderful book, Team of Teams, did exactly this on a nuclear submarine, where he undertook never to give another command on a nuclear submarine other than the right to launch a missile. He said that was his moral and ethical responsibility. So this isn't some kind of ivory tower academic talk. We're going to have to rethink our organizations, and we're going to have to rethink how do we communicate purpose? How do we break down the silos? How do we give? Now, I think one of the challenges, people have been so conditioned to work in the world that we've created, they might not want some of this responsibility. Sometimes it's easier just to wait to be told what to do, because if it doesn't work, well, then it's not my responsibility. So we are going to have a number of mind shifts that
Keith, now you're talking about committees, right? At least half of committees in organizations are designed merely to cover the decision maker's butt, right? So that the person doesn't make a decision, they take it to a committee. And the committee discusses it and comes up with plans which then half of which are ignored anyway. But this talks to organizational structure as well, doesn't it? That we don't need half of the structures we've got if we become an adaptive organization. In fact, most of the structures we've got are part of the reason why you're struggling to deal with the COVID crisis at the moment, because you're trying to have all your committee meetings and everything, and you're not being able to get to them.
Graeme, I've been playing with a phrase that I can't get out my head. I read about it the other day as I've been doing a lot of work around how do we truly talk about and build adaptive organizations. And the phrase was this: your structure should become your strategy. Now think about that for a moment. That's never been the case. But when you understand the need for a company to be able to pivot quickly, to respond instantaneously, if your structure doesn't allow that, it always is going to be an uphill battle trying to be adaptive. But if you've got a structure that can mold and shape and change its shape in response to what it is experiencing, that becomes your strategy. So I think there's a tremendous amount of depth in when you start to understand your structures, your strategy. There are 5 elements of an organizational culture that if you want to be adaptive, you can benchmark yourself against these 5 things. Should we just run through them quickly?
Please go.
So the first one is, if you've got an adaptive organization or adaptive culture, naming elephants in the room is the norm. You and I have both been in meetings where clearly there's an elephant in the room and no one wants to mention it because of the politics involved or because of a fear factor, and you just kind of bypass it. So if you've got an adaptive culture, naming elephants is the norm, not the exception, the norm. It's that kind of robustness. The second characteristic is you institutionalize reflection and learning. So again, they're not marginalized. They're not put into a category or to a silo. They're not things you do if you've got time and budget or every now and then you feel you need to do it. You institutionalize reflection and learning. I don't sit in many executive meetings where there's a true amount of reflection, where silence, stepping back, reflecting. The third characteristic is you encourage independent judgment. That goes back to your sales example. You encourage that. You don't minimize it. You encourage independent judgment. The fourth characteristic is you nurture shared responsibility. So again, very often with bureaucracy, with hierarchies, with silos, there's no shared responsibility. Responsibility keeps getting defaulted upwards or downwards or whatever, but there's a collective shared responsibility for the outcomes and for the initiatives. And then the last characteristic is you develop the capacity of leaders. And each one of those 5 areas obviously has a lot of detail and a lot of discussion, but a quick litmus test, you want to know how to the extent to which you're an adaptive organization, how do you score across those 5 areas? That will give you a large indication.
Keith, we do have some people joining in the conversation with us, and I'll try and summarize some of what's been said. Do we have any examples of organizations, large or small, well-known or not, that are in fact adaptive, that people could look to?
Yeah, there are some, and I'm always hesitant to point to a specific organization because it's always difficult and it might not be an industry. So if somebody's looking for examples, I would direct them back to the book Turn the Ship Around by Dave, what was his name? Marquette. And I'd point them to Team of Teams. And the danger of that is that they're both non-corporates. They're military examples, and that has to be held in caution. But they are institutions, and they are institutions that you are synonymous with command and control and hierarchy and bureaucracy, etc. And I think that would be the best place to start rather than dive into a specific corporate example. Can you think of any corporate examples, Graeme?
Yeah, I think that there are some examples. There's an example of I think it's a South Korean company that was written up in the Harvard Business Review a number of months ago that has really moved towards self-organizing teams.
You're talking about Haier, the Chinese company, Haier.
Sorry, Chinese, not South Korean. So Haier has moved that, and Harvard Business Review did a wonderful review of them. I think companies like Zappos, for example, before they were bought by Amazon, tried to work in this way. And even Amazon itself and some of the other competitors with Amazon are companies like WeChat as well in the digital space, use some of these principles. And so there are organizations around the world that are beginning to shift in this direction. But it's always dangerous to look for examples of other organizations because you don't have their culture, you don't have their history, you don't have their context. And so in this environment, it's not actually easy to just point to examples that everybody else could copy.
Exactly, Graeme. And, we blighted with this understanding of best practice. We look for best practice and we think, well, if only we can adopt that. And again, I think best practice is one of those tools we need to get rid of because it stops us looking far and wide enough for good examples. So if you as a CEO or as a leader saying, well, I really do understand this message and I want my company to be adaptive, don't go and look for other corporate examples and fall into the trap of, okay, let's mimic them or let's copy them because of what you've said. Go and get hold of Halflich's The Practice of Adaptive Leadership. Understand the theory of adaptive leadership and then say, all right, how do we implement this? And in what areas do we start building this? Because your adaptive profile will be unique to you. So you take the principles of adaptive leadership and you start applying them and working them in and start to massage and change the DNA of your organization to make sure that you become an adaptive organization. It's hard work.
Lucy adds something to this as well, which I think is great. She says, surely all of this begins with trust. The top of the organization doesn't believe that the people they have placed below them are fit to make decisions on their own. The organization is structured to create safety and to shift away from individual decision making. One has to surely start with how we learn to trust the teams that we put in place.
Well, again, this is why what we said earlier, it's a complete dismantling of decades of building organizations, because when management was first introduced, the whole idea was to take away trust from the worker, to take away the artisans. That meant any unskilled labor could do the job that previously had been the preserve of artisans. So when you go back to the foundations of how management emerged and how organizations were built, we have just been progressively adding layer upon layer about how do we create greater efficiencies. And that's why COVID is going to force a complete reset. It's going to force us to think about organizations in a completely different way. And Lucy's completely right. The foundations of building an adaptive organization are underpinned by trust and purpose. If you can't trust the people and they don't understand what it is we are in business to achieve beyond just the rhetoric, you can't go further. So it's going to take time to build the trust and the sense of purpose. Then you can move towards this empowered organization of dismantling things that get in the way of authority. So the other very helpful thing, Graeme, which you're aware of in adaptive leadership, it distinguishes the difference between authority and leadership. You can lead without authority. And if you have authority, it doesn't mean to say you're leading. And so we've got to disentangle this notion of authority within our organizations.
And Egon makes another point which links in here. So Keith, you've talked about the power of everybody understanding the purpose, and kind of we trust that everybody does understand the purpose and is aligned in getting us towards the common goal. But the next level below that is competence. You can only trust somebody if you also believe that they are capable of doing what you're trusting them to do. And a lot of leadership doesn't take responsibility for developing the competence of the people that they lead. And so that, you check in with everybody and you measure inputs, but you don't train people so that you can leave them alone in their expertise and just measure their outputs. And so two big components of adaptive organizations is making sure that everybody is competent to do the job that they are given authority to do. So you can't just do that on day one. You can't just hand over decision-making to people who wouldn't be capable of doing it. But then the second thing you do is then you step back from the micro measurements of those people. If they are competent, you don't measure their hours. You don't ask when did they start their working day, when did they end their working day. You simply ask, did they deliver? And if they can deliver what they need to deliver in 4 hours, you trust that they'll use the other hours to add even more value to the business, or just become a better human being in the process. And we move completely away from the way we have been measuring people in the past to measuring those outputs and their contribution based on what they are good at. So these are significant shifts. I think a lot of people are struggling at the moment to kind of justify how many hours they're working. Most people I know are working way too hard simply to prove to their bosses that they're still working, because it's an inputs-based mindset at the moment, and it's being clocked by hours rather than outputs.
Again, Graeme, you might want to give that example you were telling me about a person who was told they could work from home but had to log certain hours. Before that, again, that's why reading Team of Teams or Turn the Ship Around is so significant, because again, building the right foundation in these areas is absolutely critical to then adding the building blocks of adaptive leadership. And again, it's unbundling or undoing so much of what we've previously had in our minds around, well, people need to be told what to do, they're not competent, they can't be trusted, and all of that's going to be challenged. But you were telling me an amazing example before we went live about that person who had...
Exactly, just somebody I know in my friendship circle who was saying, their company is now trying to get back into working, and they've been given the option to work from home if they're not comfortable to come to the office. So far so good, except if they work from home, they've been told they have to start working at 8:30 and give 9 hours continuous without a break, because that's office hours. And I don't think that's the specific way it was phrased might be exceptional, but I don't think it's an exceptional attitude, in the sense that I've heard a lot of people who have been measured and judged by making sure they're keeping office hours, even being required to dress up for their webinars, and put a suit and tie on basically to come to a webinar. And then parents doing that to their school kids who are working from home, but they're being forced to put on a school uniform by parents. And then parents take a lovely photograph at 8:00 and put it on the community WhatsApp group, just to put all of that passive aggressive pressure on all the other parents in the community to say, well, my child is ready for work. It's just, in my mind, it blows my mind, actually, that this is the way that a lot of people are living and working in the world. And I think COVID is shining a spotlight on a significant problem with the way we measure our contribution and our success.
Graeme, I think if I was part of an executive right now, the conversation I would be having, either virtually or when we can get back to around the table, would be around let's step back from our business and the industry we are in. Firstly, there might be questions to ask, has this industry got a future? Because we're going to see a lot of businesses and a lot of industries hit dead ends. And so that's you're looking out the window, and there's a way to do that. But then if you kind of answered those questions to say, yes, we have a place and a relevance, then to really start questioning, well, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and what do we need to change, and have an honest conversation around that, because you might find that your productivity levels haven't dropped at all. So people haven't been coming into the office, and that leads to all kinds of things of why do we need to hire this office space? What is it when we are together needs to be accomplished? Why do we need to be together? Who needs to be together? What needs are being met by being together? What does flexibility look like? How do we measure? How do we create accountability for the responsibility that and these are all good conversations. Building an adaptive culture or being an adaptive leader is not easy, because adaptability goes to a level beneath efficiencies and operational execution. It goes to things like, what are our priorities? What do we believe about ourselves and our business? What habits do we want to ensure exist in our business? What loyalties are there? And that's the level you're playing at. And so when you start to have those conversations about evaluating your business in the light of our current context, I think all kinds of new things will emerge. And if you're going to have that conversation, make sure it's just not the familiar people having that conversation. Open the conversation up. Hear from different people in your organization. Everybody. You see, one of the tenets of adaptive leadership is it sees leadership, your organization, systemically. It sees it as a system, not as a building block of silos. And when you start to, and Peter Senge wrote about this decades ago, when you start to understand systemic thinking, it changes how you then approach certain challenges and how you build momentum and what strategy looks like. So it's a fundamental reset. But again, there's no quick fix. There's no three things you can do. You've got to go back and read. You've got to go back and reflect as a leader or as a leadership team. I would make the entire executive team read those two books, Team of Teams and The Practice of Adaptive Leadership.
Sharon's recommended another book that I'm sure you would agree with. I do, Maverick by Ricardo Semler.
So I mean, the value of Maverick is that Maverick unpacks practicalities. He's in a position as a CEO. Harvard used to send their MBA students through Semco, which was the organization that Ricardo Semler set up in Brazil. And we loved it for a couple of reasons. One, it was in Brazil, one of the BRICS countries. And again, Maverick and the 7-day 7-day week. Yeah. He talks very practically about what this could look like. There's a level beneath that because he was able to do what he did because he understood some of the theoretical constraints and possibilities. So, but Maverick, yes, and it's an old book. It's been around for a long time, but he shared leadership responsibilities. And he said the test for him, he was involved in a very bad car accident that took him out of business for close on a year. And Semco did not miss a beat. They had continual double-digit growth for over a decade in the volatility of the Brazilian economy. And when their CEO was sidelined through this automobile accident, they did not miss a beat. And he said, if ever there was proof in the pudding, that was it. We had built an adaptive organization.
Yeah. And Keith, for me, this is the reason why I'm becoming just more and more and more passionate about speaking about this. Because you say some of these books are old, and yes, they are. It's because a number of people, theorists and leadership development experts, people like ourselves, have been seeing this coming for a decade or more. We've been seeing the natural end of the industrial mindset, this mindset that started with scientific management and built these big monolithic organizations where each person was just a cog in the system. And there was a whole guidebook on how you did your little cog piece of the machine. And we've all been saying for a while now, for 2 decades, this is coming to an end. This era of history is coming to an end. The digital revolution, the connection economy, the globalization of the world, the interconnectivity of different cultures and different ways of doing things are all bringing massive shifts that won't just come and then you can deal with them and then it's sorted. They're bringing constant disruptive change. And COVID, we didn't predict it as the catalyst, but it's as good a catalyst as anything else was to show us that this is now the new world that's beginning to emerge. Even when the COVID crisis is over, the world that exists after COVID is going to be a world in which you don't know where you are. And you can't do annual budgets and 5 and 10-year strategies, and you can't just tell everybody to just be a cog in the machine. You're going to have an adaptive team, a team that flexes, as we've been talking about, self-organizing, is able to morph quickly and to change, that has different systems in place. And so what Keith and I are passionate about is to say to leaders, don't waste the COVID crisis. You're being forced to be adaptive now to even survive. Don't see it as a temporary thing, and then you get back to the normal of the command and control and structure and systems. See this as a gift. See this as something that forces you to become adaptive so that you can survive, but then you become adaptive so that you can thrive in the rest of the 2020s. Keith, I think we've probably said all we needed to say, but what would be some practical advice that you would give to somebody who's heard what we've got to say and says, okay, I get that conceptually, but my organization, my team is far from that. Paul's even just made a comment now saying, he's got people in his team who he can't just leave them to be adaptive because they're struggling at the moment. They're outside of the structures that were in place and they lost. What do you do? What is a person, a leader in an organization who senses that what we're saying is right? What do they do next? Let's summarize.
To Paul and others like Paul, I think you start with your sphere of influence. So if you're listening in and you're the CEO and you have the biggest lever in your hand, then there's an awful lot you can do. Your sphere of influence and your business context is huge. But I'd suspect many of the people listening are team leaders, they are divisional leaders, etc. But start with your sphere of influence. One of the challenges about being an adaptive leader is that you need to go beyond your level of authority, and there's risk in that, and it becomes a political game. Because if you really believe in what we've been saying and you've read the book Adaptive Leadership and you understand this and say, start with your sphere of influence. If you wait till those at the top understand this message and get it, you'll be waiting forever. So the question is, what can you do here and now within your sphere of influence? And as I said, the caution is that you probably are going to have to exceed your authority, and there is risk in that. But this is scary territory, and if we are going to change things, there's no safe, there's no risk-free journey into adaptive leadership for anybody sitting anywhere in the organization. So be deliberate, think about what you can do, where you can experiment, where you can own what is called your part of the mess, because it might get messy. There are two things you have to manage in adaptive leadership. You have to manage yourself and your own ability to be uncomfortable with discomfort, and you have to manage the discomfort of others that you're dealing with. And when you look at the discomfort of others, you have to look at all the stakeholders involved in the process. You have to look at the alliances that they have. You have to ask questions like, who's going to lose the most here? And this is the savviness that you have to demonstrate, because all of those things are valid and need to be understood. So start with your own sphere of influence, understand what it is you want to do, and then start experimenting. Some experiments will fail, and that's okay, and you own that. But you're probably also going to have to exceed your authority. But if you do it cautiously and you do it well and you do it sensitively and you do it in some ways by the playbook that Harflich and his colleagues have laid out for us, you will make significant headway, and your team or your division will probably be one that others very quickly look to, because they'll be saying, what on earth is going on there? How does he or she keep his people so engaged, so empowered? Why are they running? You will achieve the results you want. That's the only advice I could give.
I'll add just three simple, hopefully practical things to that. First is, stop trying to get back to normal. So this is a gift. Embrace the disruption that we've been given as COVID. Don't try and get back to what you had. Ask yourself some of the questions that Keith has suggested. Ask questions about what would be a better way? How can we reimagine what we are doing? So embrace the disruption, embrace the chaos, and use this as an excuse to come out the other side and do something completely different. Rob made a comment, Keith, for example, about higher education, and him saying he thinks universities will just go back to normal. I don't think so. I've actually done work with 2 universities in the last few weeks, and both are trying to reimagine what a hybrid campus might look like. In other words, never going back to simply having all the students on campus going to classes again. Embracing the fact that we can use digital education tools. So that would just be a simple example. Embrace the disruption. Don't go back to normal. The second thing that you should do, I think, is focus on connecting and engaging and empowering your teams. So if you're a leader, again, you have the tools and the levers in place to do that. If you're not part of a leader, do it anyway, and engage with your team to say, how do we bring authority closer to your responsibility? What is it that you need to do? What information do you need? What systems do you need around you? What authority do you need that you don't have? So ask these questions now of each member of your team. Ask it of yourself. And if you need more information, request it. If you need more training to become more competent, request it. Get involved in the system and in helping other people to be fully engaged in the system. And then the third thing I would do, and this is the unashamed sales piece, is get in touch with us. Speak to our team at Tomorrow Today. Get us to help you to think through this. If all we do is provide you with a list of resources and some books to read and some podcasts to listen to, it'll still have been worth it. If you have the budget and you can use us as consultants and leadership development coaches within your system, we'd be happy to do that. We just are concerned that too many people are trying to get back to normal, and we think normal is part of the problem that will be exacerbated in the 2020s. And if you don't use this opportunity, this golden opportunity, you might survive COVID and then die by 2025 because the digital disruption takes you out, or because geopolitics shifts and takes you out, and Brexit doesn't go in the direction you thought it was going, or Donald Trump has another term, and you whatever. We can list 100 things that could completely and utterly change your environment. You've got to learn how to work and survive and thrive in a constantly changing environment. And what better time to do that than now? So if we can help you, we'd love to do that. Be in touch with our team at Tomorrow Today Global. Keith, let me give you the final word this afternoon.
The final word, it's these are challenging times, but with every challenge comes huge opportunity. I'm just thinking, Graeme, as you were speaking there about the impact of Black Lives Matter. And, besides what's happening with COVID-19 and the uncertainty, you've got society shifting in fundamental ways. And these are challenging and not easy times for leaders. And if as a leader you think that Black Lives Matter and the impact of what's happening in society is not going to be felt within your business, just like the Me Too movement before that, it is your responsibility to embrace these. And so these are not easy times, but they're exciting times, because leadership needs to look like it's never looked like in the past, and grab hold of the opportunity. We'd love to help you. We are both passionate about this. So understand that probably the first edifice that is going to have to fall is going to be that of control.
And that's the end of the adaptive leadership conversation that Keith Coates and I recorded way back at the beginning of lockdown in 2020. I hope you enjoyed listening in, and I hope that the sound quality didn't put you off. Thank you for listening to the Future of Work podcast. If you are finding it interesting and useful, please share it with your friends. Please subscribe to it on whatever platform you use, and connect with us and our team at tomorrowtodayglobal.com. We'd love to hear from you, get feedback from you on the podcast, and if we can assist you, obviously, in any ways in which you are thinking about the ways in which the future of work is changing, please make sure that you get in touch.